Can you remind me why it was that the Soviets were against Zionism or Israel?
That's a good question. There's an expert on this named Isabella Taranovsky, and she's one of the great scholars about the Soviet anti-Zionist campaign. I will say that in a simple terms, Russia was a very anti-Semitic country for centuries.
Yeah.
My family fled Russia in 1904 to Canada, and they were fleeing a very anti-Semitic country. And there were pogroms routinely, which were kind of like October 7th. Jews would be massacred and raped and so forth. And that was a constant in Russia.
Arguably the most consistently anti-Semitic country in history.
I would say so.
Yeah.
I would say so. And certainly when yes. So that's the history of Russia. And actually Vladimir Putin is the last person that I want to give credit to. But actually he's a bit of an exception as a Russian leader who he's done terrible crimes all over the world, especially today in Ukraine and other places. But he's actually one of the few Russian leaders who hasn't made anti-Semitism a pillar of his foreign policy. I guess Gorbachev as well as someone who distanced himself from that. But historically, when Stalin came, when there was the Marxist, communist, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, they were going to break with the czars. And initially, it was seen as a break with anti-Semitism, and Lenin had condemned anti-Semitism, but pretty quickly that morphed into. They said you must join the Soviet Revolution, but you have to give up any identity that you have, and any form of Jewish identity, any form of national Jewish identity, including support for the idea that the Jewish people are a distinct people and have ancient claims to their ancient homeland. That was inconsistent with the Marxist view.
Right.
And so early on, certainly by the time Stalin comes on, the 20s and 30s, you begin to have persecution of anyone who it became illegal to teach Hebrew. Rabbis were being arrested in the 20s and 30s for teaching Hebrew. Zionism was declared illegal. And certainly Stalin was anti-Semitic. And it is known that shortly before he died, he had anti-Semitic plots in the 1950s that he was going to do some very bad things to Jews, and was already accusing Jews of poisoning people. So that was part of the Soviet communist ideology. Anti-Semitism played a major role, and they were pioneers in coming up with the new forms. I mean, anti-Semitism has succeeded over time because it's a virus that mutates. Mm-hmm. It always looks for whatever appears virtuous, whatever is virtuous at the time and place in that society. Then the Jews are the enemy of that. So in a society in Soviet Russia that was communist, Jews were capitalist, colonialist, and Zionism was accused of being fascist and colonialist and capitalist and all of that sort of thing. And of course, in other societies, in a capitalist society, the Jews were accused of being communist and so on and so forth. But in Soviet Russia, they were pioneers in taking the new establishment of Israel and turning that into some kind of demonic force and spreading it using the Marxist network all around the world, including to the third world, which we now call the developing world, but also into the left-wing mainstream in Europe. And that was coming out of Moscow, consistent, massive production of propaganda that equated the state of Israel with the Nazis and Zionism as racism, adopted by the UN 50 years ago. And we're seeing its development today, where Israel is, once again, this evil state, genocidal. This stuff begins from Soviet Russia.
So this 1975 moment's very interesting then.
Yes, 50th anniversary. Yeah.
You'll correct me if I've got this wrong, but there's been something like 700 UN resolutions against Israel, but only about 300 against all other nations combined. If I understand
that could be our own website, the UN Watch database lists. We've tracked the past 10 years of the General Assembly. And the numbers are in that range. It's something like 170 in the past 10 years, 170 against Israel at the General Assembly, and maybe it's 50 or 60 on the rest of the world combined. In a given year, you will have one resolution. Most countries are zero. Most countries never get criticized. There's never been condemnation at the General Assembly of China, Cuba, Venezuela, Russia, Saudi Arabia. Sorry, not Russia. Russia was criticized. But Saudi Arabia, most countries in the world, 185 countries, have zero. A few countries get criticized. Each year there's one on Iran, one on Syria, one on North Korea, and about 17 on Israel. That's in a regular year.
Absolutely shocking. So this 1975 moment then seems to be quite pivotal because in 1947, of course, famously, we have Resolution 181,
yes,
which is when the state of Israel, the partition of Palestine is set forth at the UN. And by 1975, so less than 30 years later,
right,
you have a complete flip where the UN themselves are now completely anti-Zionist.
Correct. On 29 November 1947, the UN General Assembly, as you said, endorsed the partition plan, which called to partition what was British Mandatory Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And in that resolution, 181 of 1947, it speaks of a Jewish state 30 times, Jewish state. And then barely 3 decades later, not even 3 decades later, the very idea of a Jewish state is declared a form of racism. And keep in mind, this is a time when dozens and dozens of countries had joined the UN in the 1960s in the decolonization era under the banner of national self-liberation. And suddenly, only the cause of one people, that of the Jews, to national self-liberation in their own ancestral homeland, recognized in the League of Nations mandate for Palestine that the Jews are recognizing their ancient historic rights to the land of Israel. And suddenly that's being declared a form of racism. So this is complete subversion and inversion.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Winston Marshall Show. You can click here to watch the full episode. And for more clips like this one, don't forget to subscribe. And as always, be well.